This episode is the final part in my analysis for understanding the legitimacy and also the legal basis of the claim regarding the financial compensation of Africans for trade slavery. Well, now I'm going to approach this from the angle where I actually, hypothetically speaking, believe that it is an agreed matter that Africans, need and should be financially compensated for trade slavery. Now, the next critical question, once we are done understanding the legitimacy and the legality, of the claim, is for us to now try and understand what form exactly can reparation take and how are we going to structure the reparation, but most important, why? Why should we pay reparation, and especially financial reparation, to Africans for trade slavery? Welcome to Smart, Intellectual, Knowledgeable African. I'm Philip S.I.K.A. Before I continue discussing this interesting topic, as always, let me invite you to click on the subscribe button if you're not yet a member of this community, and to also activate the ring bell so that you don't miss out on the hot topic. Well, this can actually sound like a trivial question. Why should we pay reparation to Africans for trade slavery? It may be a trivial question for several reasons, but I can think of few arguments around that. First, for some people, it may be obvious, For other people, it may not be that obvious. It may just be irrelevant. But in any case, why should we pay, or why should we even consider paying for financial reparation? Well, beyond the legitimacy of doing so, beyond also the existence of legal basis that actually help validate the point, there is another aspect we need to consider. We need to consider the damage, the economic damage, the social damage, and the cultural damage, and also the human damage, right? Well, let's look at the human damage. Well, the human damage is quantifiable, which means that we can look at it in terms of numbers. And for the past, 4 centuries during which trade slavery was actually implemented, it led to, the enslavement and the trading of over 30 million African people. That's a lot. Over 30 million African people. And I am actually tempted to extrapolate that number, and I'm going to tell you why. Well, back then, we did not have the same technology as of today to make sure that we could minimize the error factor in, quantifying and addressing whatever situation we wanted to try and understand. The technology was not as sophisticated as of today. And second, trade slavery was a practice that mostly happened without computers. People had to use ledger to make sure that, they keep the name of their slave, which they consider as the property or some sort of stock. So based on the volatility of information, I may actually say that it can be fair to even double up that amount, and say that it may roughly, lead to around 60 million of people who have been enslaved, like 60 million of African people, young, women, men, children, that were actually put by force into a state, of being that was completely evil. So this is actually the first damage. We had an entire continent that was a strip of the most valued people. And why that is very important? Because the human damage leads straight to economic damage. The economic damage here is that if you do not have a lot of valid people to actually make sure that they are going to work, in the farms, they are also to be able to let me try and think of a very critical and realistic example. For your economy to develop, you need human capital. And it's not about just the number, but it is also about the quality. And the quality of the people that you have can be, summarized into two aspects. Well, you have the skills that they need to have, but they also need to be healthy. They also need to be in good shape. Because what are you going to do with sick people and elderly? If you have a population where most of your citizens are actually over 60, how strong can you and how strong can you actually build your economy and develop your economy in the long term? Which is actually what happened, in Africa during 4 centuries, of trade slavery. The continent was consistently deprived of the most valid, people. The most valued economic contributors to its development were actually deported into foreign lands to actually work for other countries and help other countries, build roads, build schools, develop their economy, develop their agriculture system and agricultural production. The African people know-how and technology was also transferred, into those colonies. Because unlike general opinion and unlike, widely shared opinions, African used to leave the country with some local resources like tobacco and etc. Well, I think it is very safe to also say that perhaps the Westerners improved the agricultural technology. But we should also understand that before they even invaded the African coast and African lands, tobacco was already produced in Africa. African people were already producing their crops, their agricultural crops, meaning that they also had some sort of technology. And it is very unfair to, overlook that aspect. So trade slavery, did not just have a strong damage in terms of human capital, but also in terms of economy. In terms of social and cultural, it is perhaps the same, even more. We've seen, the deportation of traditional heritage, from Africa to foreign lands. We've seen people lifestyle, people belief crash down, to the very bottom. So all these elements are actually one of the most important, damages suffered by, African slaves. Another aspect when trying to consider why do Africans need reparation is also in terms of labor law. In terms of labor law, we were in a situation where first you had people working against the will. Second, We also had situations where people were working without getting paid. And thirdly, we also had a situation where actually people were working longer hours. Like they did not have the normal shift of 8 working hours. They were working 10, 12, 14 hours a day. Look, these are actually serious, situations. These are actually serious situations that actually help anyone understand why it is very urgent to sit down and consider, like the reparation when it comes to trade slavery. And another reason why we should consider reparation is because not just, like I said, Jewish people or Japanese American or Maori people, in the history of the world received financial compensation. But in the history of trade slavery, we've seen situations where it was actually slave owners who got compensated instead of the victims. And I can think of the case of England, where actually slave owners received from the government over £6 million then, which actually equates to 10 billion US dollars. Can we imagine that? We are actually in a scenario where it is very difficult, to fathom reparation, financial compensation for the victims. But back then, it was very simple and very easy to fathom, a situation where slave owners receive some sort of compensation because they had to let go of their properties. That was actually rational here. So why does the topic of financial reparation aching so many people? Why is it that when it is conceivable for other population, it may be not conceivable for African people? Well, I have a theory. And again, it's just a theory because I don't have anything sustainable, to substantiate my theory. But I think it has to do with the economic weight of the African continent, the economic weight of African nations. Unfortunately, this is a wake-up call, for many African leaders, but also for many African people. Like, unfortunately, the continent is the only one continent in the world, that has to do a lot of, a lot of begging, a lot of lobbying, a lot of asking, to receive what it has to receive, to actually be acknowledged the way it should be acknowledged. And this is very unfortunate because we are living in an era and in an economic, structure where the least, economically strong you are, the least, you are going to have an impact or to make an impact in terms of international decision. The least your voice, is going to be heard. When you're taking, for instance, the payment that actually happened in the case of Jewish people and Japanese American, in my opinion, this is not random. Look at the economic structure, of the world. You'll see that Jewish people are among the smartest people in the world. They are among, those who actually create the most profitable business. You taking, for instance, the financial and banking American sector, you'll see that it is dominated by Jewish people. You also look at, Japanese. Japan is the second, most important, economy in the world, the second most, important economy in the world. like after the United States of America. You see that Japanese industry is one of the most important and one of the most internationally competitive, like in addition to the German industry. So you see that the people that I'm talking about, the race, the nation that I'm mentioning, like yes, suffered some sort of atrocities. They suffered some hardship in the past, but they've been able, to make demands for reparation while also focusing on their economic development. And this is something that, African needs to understand. This is also something that, African leaders and non-African leaders, who are actually proponent of the motion for financial compensation also include in their narrative. In order for this claim, to reach to the most powerful of our time, in order for this claim to make sense, it has to also be strongly linked with the economic waking up of the continent. Africa needs to weigh more in terms of international trade, in terms of international development, in terms of, financial and economic prowess and performances. The African continent has to stop relying, on. Let me stop there. So now that we have a pretty good idea and understanding of why reparation matters, let's try to answer those critical questions in terms of like identifying the beneficiaries and making sure that whatever financial reparation that is going to be paid or received will actually go to the right people and also produce, the right like expected outcome. Well, it is not as difficult. I think if we can find record of the impact of trade slavery, I think where there is a will, there is a way. And if there is a will, there is definitely be a way. So identifying the beneficiaries, in my opinion, should not be a very daunting or a difficult task. It may be challenging, but it is not impossible. Then to me, the key question after agreeing to paying some sort of financial compensation is to make sure that whatever financing that's going to be disbursed are going to be channeled into the right, economic sector, are going to actually produce the maximum impact in terms of the economic development of the continent. Because in my analysis, in my opinion, I actually based my reasoning around the economic impact, but there's also the social impact, which leads straight to the human impact. Of course, we can identify some descent, of slaves. If that's the case, I will happily say that they deserve the money, like what happened for Japanese American. But in the event where I think it may be more challenging, to identify individuals, to identify like families, why not, create a fund that is going to receive the money and invest, at a country level or at a community level? Because at the end of the day, whether or not we can trace back our origin, I personally believe that many Africans, whether I'm talking about the Africans living in Africa and the African diaspora or the African American or the African Caribbean, many Africans, I'm pretty sure, have some roots and some DNA that trace back, to trade slavery. So in my analysis and in my opinion, one of the best ways, of using whatever financial compensation that may take form should be, like through the creation of investment specific funds that are going to invest in specific economic sectors within a specific geography. Tell me your opinion. Let me know what you think about this approach. Let me know also about your position when it comes to this very hot topic. I hope that throughout the 4 parts that I developed, I succeed in providing you with the most powerful perspectives. Thank you for listening to this episode, and remember, S.I.K.A Talks is your podcast where strong realities meet powerful perspective. À bientôt.